Hello, honeys, and welcome to our very first episode dedicated solely to the Cubist and the Primitivist movements. Today, we'll be talking about the major artists from both of these movements, how and why they were problematic, how to recognize their works, and how the two connected to larger contexts and even other movements. Today's sources include everyone from the National Gallery of Art to the MoMA, the Guggenheim, the National Galleries of Scotland, and even the Met. And so, honeys, let's focus in on the early 20th century, late 19th century, and talk about the primitive problems of Picasso. Art history is all about chronology, building from the past, so we're going to start at the start here today with some key context and backstory. The term primitive itself has a longer history in art. For example, MoMA points out that in the mid-19th century, it was primarily applied to 14th and 15th century Italian and Flemish art, which was popular with the artists of the day because of its perceived simplicity, sincerity, and expressive power. The term primitive only really started to branch out and reference a broader range of non-Western art as we think of it today after about the 1850s. So the obvious question, why did it shift? Long answer short, it was a changing world and artists had greater exposure to art now from across the globe. The late 19th century saw this influx of tribal arts from Africa, Oceania, and Native Americans into Europe, which offered artists located in Europe a new visual vocabulary to explore. Many artists saw these so-called primitive styles as a way to critique the stagnant, in their minds, traditions of European painting through uses of simpler shapes, abstract figures, and really just sharply break here with traditional European styles of representation. According to the Dallas Art Museum, one of the major early moments where artists got this exposure was the opening of the Trocadero Museum in 1878. The Trocadero was the first museum to display African groups' artworks in Paris, then the hub of the arts world. It saw a ton of artist visitors who found, quote-unquote, inspiration in the artworks, often thinking that it was especially physically direct and emotionally charged in their own words. Apart from how they exoticized it, I have a little sympathy for the artists here because they were genuinely excited about this new thing and took their obsession a little too far. Some artists even began building their own collections of African and oceanic arts. After the opening of the Trocadero, there was a large-scale embrace of these styles in France, but soon that spread into Europe and through to America as well. A key thing to remember about any artistic movement is that it has to have some core something to hold it together. In Primitivism's case, that was an attitude that spawned a cohesive movement. Primitivist attitudes were not too far off from some attitudes we see today. There was an element of wishing for the quote-unquote good old days before the massive increase in technology and industrialization, before diversity was a concept in people's mind because the world was becoming more interconnected. But really, as the tape puts it, it was a follow-up in many ways to colonial attitudes of superiority. They write, quote, "At the beginning of the 20th century, France, like most European countries, was a colonial power. Attitudes towards non-Western countries, particularly African and Oceanic, were a mixture of fascination and disdain," end quote. Now, in the interest of recognizing the counter-argument, the Dallas Art Museum notes that the use of the term primitive and the process of borrowing from before, the past, is not necessarily limited to non-Western art. Some primitivists also looked to surviving artworks from their own culture's prehistoric pasts, as well as folk arts, untrained arts, and arts made by children. Still, though, these were few and far between, so we've got to stick with the bigger, badder part for a minute here. In no uncertain terms, smart history tells us that primitivist attitudes were a result of anxieties surrounding the rapid social, economic, and political changes that were part and parcel of the scientific and industrial revolutions of the 17th through 19th centuries. And these anxieties do make a little sense when you consider that the European societies at large were experiencing a total change of cultural patterns from a foundation of religion and agriculture to one of science, machines, city life. These changes resulted in widespread crises of faith, worsening and less job prospects, as well as these sort of grinding factory work lifestyles instead of small town, easier ones. So many, of course, are looking for simplicity, nostalgia, and ease. If this sounds at all familiar, it should. So, what exactly was primitivism? Who are these artists responding to? And why it's hard to define in style, but easy to recognize? Primitivism, despite its faults, was not just a romanticized imitation of non-Western art and culture. It was a purposeful rejection of established artistic norms, European norms, I should say. It began with the Fauves, the Cubists, and the De Bruck movements, who incorporated such backwards-looking elements of it into their own work. As I suggested, it mattered at its time because it was not necessarily a singular style, but rather it was an artistic trend that spanned diverse modern artists and nations and mediums. It's pretty significant that all these people at the vanguard were looking backwards in time and afar for inspiration to radically change the direction of painting in the face of this new industrialized city populous world. So what were some of its key differences from the Academy-approved mainstreams? Many avant-garde artists saw the Academy's naturalistic style as only suitable to represent the surface appearance of material objects. Those looking for other means of representation saw primitive and folk arts as a truly natural way to draw beyond perceptions to indicate concepts and other things within an artwork. Essentially, the Tate says that the phenomenon of primitivism was a reassessment of the most basic principles of European art. Artists were asking anew, what is art for? How does it affect us? How do we communicate with art? That being said, they also admit that the interest of artists in non-Western cultures was mostly formal and superficial. Few primitivists had a complex understanding of these real people, these civilizations that they were, shall we say, borrowing from. As far as the term and the movement's evolution, by the late 20th century, the term had become recognized for its derogatory connotations and fell out of favor, though the movement had ended much, much earlier, I would say like 1940s. So, clearly we have some internal issues, some baked-in biases here. The reality is that embracing the movement often led to cultural appropriation. We have to remember that this was a European-driven thing, building upon existing power imbalances. Says Smart History, quote, "It is no coincidence that primitivist art was created and consumed by Western nations that were at the same time practicing colonialism, occupying and plundering much of Africa, Asia, and the Americas for labor and resources," end quote. Some of the biases issues are obvious just in the paradoxical language that primitivists used. Let's start with the name itself. Framing other cultures as primitive insinuates a need for external aid and leadership by suggesting an inability to progress, to problem solve, to do really anything on one's own. This helplessness, sort of primitive connotation, was often used to justify Western colonial practices. Smart History did a really nice sum up of it as it applies to the arts by saying that the definition of primitivism has a basic contradiction. The so-called primitive is admired, seen as a model even, and imitated, yet at the same time, it's considered to be inferior, considered to be at an earlier stage of this supposedly common scale of human development. The fraught definition allows the primitivist to, at the same time, steal from and demean other cultures' works. For evidence, we can look to the dozens of colonial exhibitions of art objects, replicas of villages across the world from the 18th through the 20th centuries, probably even before the 18th. And in the most shameful, egregious example of primitivist attitudes, we can look at human zoos, in which ethnic quote-unquote specimens would enact their cultural practices for curious spectators throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Of course, those spectators were almost always white people. Now, as I said, it can be really hard to tell primitivist works at a glance. Unlike most isms, there's no consistent characteristics here. That being said, there are definitely certain tropes connected to specific popular primitivist or cubist artists who used them a ton. So rather than going artwork by artwork, we're going to go artist by artist here today and talk about the connections between these two movements. And I say it that way because if it's cubist, it's also definitely primitivist. So much of that fractured form, multiple perspective thing going on in Cubism was based on African mask art and sculpture, which almost as a rule uses abstracted geometric patterns and bright colors. In fact, a lot of the Cubists used specifically mask imagery in their subject matter. I will say this, honeys, because Cubism is under the Primitivism umbrella, some of the Cubist traits are general giveaways for Primitivism. For example, both Cubism and Primitivism frequently demonstrate a lack of emphasis on natural appearances. They're more concerned with transmitting sensation, emotion. Both styles incorporate a noticeable flatness. There's not a lot of depth visible in an image, and they don't do linear perspective, and they also don't really do narrative. So we've established a few repeat traits across primitivist works, but let's get into the tropes more specifically as they're the most recognizable. One of the most defining as well as the most problematic concepts of primitivism, the trope of the noble savage. This oxymoronic phrase is now recognized as a stereotype and often was wrongly attributed, in fact, to the 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The noble savage is a stock character who has no education, no technology, no cultural refinement, but who lives according to universal natural laws of morality and goodness, and therefore is inherently better than his European counterpart, more innocent in some ways. For examples in movies of the noble savage trope, we can look to Pocahontas, Tarzan, The Gods Must Be Crazy, Dances with Wolves, and both Avatar as well as the Way of Water one. The Avatar example is so perfect because the indigenous Na'vi people are technologically inferior to the invading humans in that film, but the Na'vi are morally superior because they are literally and emotionally closer to nature. An important note here is that the Na'vi are loosely based, like factually admitted, loosely based on Native Americans, and this shows how the myth still comes up today. Unfortunately, the artist most associated with this trope is the one that I am the least personally enthusiastic about, Paul Gauguin. Gauguin was a Frenchman born 1848 who died 1903. He started making work considered notable by the art world in around the 1890s when he began spending extensive time periods in Tahiti, which was a French colony at the time. It's widely acknowledged that he was spending the time there as a sort of retreat from the Western civilization. He was really fascinated by colonialist tropes of exoticism that were prevalent at the time. In short, Gauguin didn't really care about traditional European painting anymore, but he also didn't really get down with Impressionism. African and Asian arts, though, those seemed mysterious and lively. So in 1891, Gauguin leaves France for the South Pacific island, and in 1893, he starts making it his whole personality. He starts acting in a way he thinks is exotic. He starts dressing in Polynesian clothing. And this is why I say ew every single time I have to mention him, aside from now, because I'm trying to be mature and not say ew every 5 seconds. He not only conducted a public affair with a young woman still in her teens, He also married 3 adolescent Tahitian girls with whom he later fathered children early on in his years on the island. And I do mean adolescent, like extremely underage, like 13. But because karma is a good bitch, he struggled a lot in health and finance terms throughout the later years in Tahiti, and his time on the Marquesas Islands were marked by more health issues and financial struggles. And because he's just so shitty, at the end of July 1893, Gauguin ditches his current wife and kid. He goes back to Tahiti a few more times in the following years, but was a total deadbeat dad. So we know why Gauguin sucks. He claimed to admire and respect the Tahitian people and their way of life, but was clearly exploiting every person, especially the young women that he came into contact with. The problem is that his images still essentially define and perpetuate the noble savage idea, and the reality is that it never existed. In the words of the National Gallery of Art, quote, he found his dream of an unspoiled earthly paradise in Tahiti severely compromised. As in Europe, he saw discord and a native culture overcome by Western values, including the need for capital to live, end quote. But Gauguin, instead of accepting reality, editorialized. Some of his scenes of Tahitian life include bits of reality, but most combine multiple cultural traditions, including South Asian and Egyptian as well as Oceanic. In his artworks, Gauguin made careful selections to reinforce pre-existing European stereotypes of vibrant and colorful tropical paradises far away from home. The figural part of his scenes is where the noble savage part comes in. These paradises that Gauguin makes are almost exclusively filled with young, semi-nude women, making these paradises seem very sexual, very exotic, and very dehumanizing. Where men are featured in Gauguin's works, they are stoic warriors and breadwinners. They're depicted totally emotionless, always muscly, and absolute stereotypes. So what are a couple of Gauguin's most telling artworks that use this noble savage trope? The first is called Seed of Arroweye. Here we can see not only primitivism, but the noble savage idea in the stiffness of the girl's pose, the reduction of her anatomy to basic geometric shapes, the flatness of this overall space, and the almost total non-use of shadowing. Yet his Spirit of the Dead Watching from 1892 is considered the prime example of primitivism and the noble savage, especially because it so clearly reflects his fascination with Tahitian culture, spirituality, and, of course, with underage girls. The work uses these ruse-like purples and blues in the shadows underneath the bed and the color of the background wall to create a very tense atmosphere. Furthermore, that Tahitian woman figure is laying face down with her arms kind of pinned underneath and her hands near her face. She looks very uncomfortable. She looks trapped. Yet the figure behind her, it's unclear if the person is a woman or man, is wearing all black and looks on while she, the lying figure, looks at us. The relationships, the narratives are so unclear, and yet there's the element of a ghostly presence hinted at here. Because the young woman in the image is in this way associated with submission, sex, spirituality, curses, all these kind of mysterious things, she's absolutely fitting the noble savage idea. Though we've inherently touched on it quite a bit already, our second trope is the tropical paradise ideal. This is the stereotype of a place outside of time, filled with beauty and bounty, with only base worries, a place that allows inhabitants to live an easy, natural, and primitive lifestyle. The exemplary artist for this trope is most likely Henri Rousseau, who lived 1844 to 1910. Rousseau was best known for his bold, flora and fauna crowded pictures of the jungle. He was often referred to as, quote, le douanier, or the customs officer. Rousseau is a fascinating and key example of a primitivist and of the primitivism movement/attitude because he painted such exotic locales, but he never left France. Though he tried to spread some rumors that he did, Rousseau was entirely self-taught and a homebody to the end. Says the National Gallery, quote, his paintings were instead the concoctions of a city dweller, shaped by visits to the botanical gardens, the zoo, and colonial expositions, as well as images of distant lands seen in books and magazines, end quote. He did this because he wanted to create images that countered his existing record, pictures of a tranquil and familiar Paris. Rousseau's point in doing this was to create images that countered his existing record. His images of a tranquil, familiar Paris from the past were not cutting it anymore, and he wanted to reflect the desires and fears of a new modern world by creating images of this sexy, terrifying, faraway place. A few things stand out in terms of the tropical paradise with this one. First and foremost, it's literally a lion and an antelope in an extremely forested background. You just see jungle leaves everywhere. The image also nicely encapsulates some of the most standard traits of primitivism. You see here the flatness of figures, a smashing together of fore and background, simple yet vibrant color palette, a focus on wilderness, space, and animal figures. Also from Henri Rousseau, we have The Sleeping Gypsy of 1897. I mean, look at the name. This image has a sense of mystery to it. There's this unclear, dreamy narrative wherein a reclining woman and a lion are kind of not really interacting in a moonlit desert. What makes the image feel so exotic is that there are mountains and what appear to be maybe a river or a sea in the background. She's wearing a striped dress. She's clearly a Black woman, and there's some sort of stringed instrument by her side. The image seems to reference potentially a couple different places and cultures, but none of them clearly are European. And before we recall the most famous primitivist of all, a few other artists of note and their tropes. We have yet another Frenchman, Henri Matisse, born in 1869 and died in November of 1954. Matisse was best known for both his use of color as well as his fluid, original draftsmanship. In his middle life, he spent some time exploring, and this led in part to his pursuit of primitivism. He first traveled to Algeria in 1906 to study African art and primitivism. Then in 1910, viewed a large Munich exhibition of Islamic art and decided to go to Spain for 2 months to study Moorish art. Between 1912 and 1913, he visited Morocco twice. It's commonly accepted that the effects of this travel included a new boldness in the use of intense, unmodulated colors in his artwork. An example that art historians often point to for this increase in that intense color is L'Atelier Rouge of 1911. Matisse also began to use black hues in his works for the first time. This may be, as the Tate points out, because Persian arts had the biggest, longest influences on him. He attempted to learn and make his own versions of their use of patterns to create senses of depth. Now, we're going to take a moment on this pattern difference because it's actually a whole lot more fascinating than even I thought. What the Tate is referring to is the fact that European patterns often have a flattening effect, but in Persian miniatures, different patterns are used to delineate different spatial areas. For example, when you look down a hallway, one room is distinct from the next because they have different patterns. Matisse considered this as a new way to show receding space in his own works. Another important note from the Tate, Matisse collected African art himself, and he's thought to be responsible for introducing it to Picasso. You can see all of Matisse's primitivism come together, his use of fluid lines and blacks, and all of the other effects of his travel, the patterns, in works such as Blue Nude from 1907, Blue Nudes from 1952, The Green Stripe of 1905, and his incredibly famous Dancers. Next, we've got, finally, for a change, a German, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who lived 1880 to 1938. He was one of the most impactful members of the Die Bruck movement that I mentioned earlier. That group rejected academic art and searched for the means to make work that felt immediate, spontaneous. Their inspirations included Van Gogh and Edvard Munch, but they were also into German Gothic and Renaissance art, which is partially why they were so into the woodcut. The Die Brucks managed to combine both of those interests with oceanic and African art that they encountered at ethnographic museums. Lots of Kirchner's works from 1909 to 1915 especially demonstrate influences of Primitivism and Cubism. There are blocky, geometric human forms, different shapes defined by color. There's a flatness to the surface. There's no depth, really. And, most telltale of all, very, very simple lines and forms. And finally, the man you've all been waiting for, Picasso, and how his works show the connections as well as the overlaps between Cubism and Primitivism. Picasso was a Spaniard who lived 1881 to 1973, and the Met notes that his, quote, prolific output includes over 20,000 paintings, prints, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, theater sets, and costumes that convey myriad intellectual, political, social, and amorous messages, end quote. Aside from Primitivism and Cubism, let's talk about other major influences on him and movements he was connected to. Being Iberian in heritage, Picasso was already very familiar with simplified, stylized, and monumental figures, especially of Iberian sculpture. The key part, though, was that he also had a fascination with African arts. Like Rousseau, he never visited the continent, but instead studied objects in the Paris ethnography museums. Picasso then made his own versions of totemic African carvings. So why was Pablo such a fan, and what exactly did he copy? Picasso was quite spiritual, quite superstitious, so he felt what seems to be a genuine alignment with the African and other art forms here. He appreciated the functional aspects of these works as well. Most of all, Picasso was fascinated by the highly stylized representations of the body coming out of African and oceanic arts. But as his name drop and the title of this episode together kind of hint at, his legacy is a bit of an issue. The frequency and similarity of borrowings by Picasso, there was air quotes there if you couldn't tell, have raised concerns about cultural appropriation that are part of the larger primitivism issues. Because Picasso copied many African and oceanic works so closely without credit, and sometimes even actively denied inspiration from non-Western arts, this is a pretty clear case of careless consumption and profiting off of other cultures by someone in what is really a dominant culture, because imperialism. You may be tempted to think, this was 100 years ago. Why does it matter now that Picasso copied other artists? The answer's kind of in the question. Look at Picasso's reputation, the prices that he commands at auctions. Look at how many textbooks and solo books and movies and TV shows that Picasso's in, and then look at the often literal anonymity of African mask makers whom he copied. That's the why it matters. The easiest image to look at and understand the relationship, the triangle between Cubism, Primitivism, and Picasso is his infamous 1907 Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The painting was considered to be groundbreaking. It marked a dramatic departure from traditional Western art by incorporating angular, mask-like faces and distorted forms. It landed a place on the art historical record because it was thought of in its day as such a shockingly literal deconstruction of conventional artistic norms. The work was considered directly counter to post-Renaissance European movements, and it was this fascinating, unprecedented challenge to the by then established rules surrounding figures, narrative, so on. Many looked at Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and saw it as a new visual language for their modern time. So where exactly does it differ or align with the things that came just before it? According to the Met, quote, The figure arrangement recalls Cézanne's compositions of bathers, while stylistically it is influenced by primitivism, evident by the angular planes and well-defined contours that create an overall sculptural solidity in the figures, end quote. That's a whole lot of words to say that the painting shows a mixing up of styles. Here, the faces of the women on the right are often seen as representations of African masks, while the figure on the left is seen as an archaic Iberian figure, going back to pre-classical Spain. We see Picasso make a bit of a nod to Manet here in some of the composition changes. Smart history reminds us that original sketches feature a man in the work, a sailor most likely, centered with the women's attentions on him, and another dude kind of off to the side. But Picasso made the decision to remove both of these male figures and instead have the women meet our gaze. It's a visual callback and a further challenge to the established European norms. The image, yet again, shows a flattening of fore and background, a real geometric construction of the human body, and that telltale lack of narrative and sense of mystery, of non-place. It's no mere rumor that Picasso was a copycat when it came to this artwork either. It's proven fact. In 1907, famously, Picasso went to see African masks exhibited at Paris's Trocadero Museum of Ethnology, and shortly after, he revised the ambitious painting to include mask-like faces on the two rightmost figures. Says art history, quote, "Thus began a 2-year engagement with African art that contributed to the invention of Cubism," end quote. Although many examples exist of Picasso, quote-unquote, borrowing from African art forms, especially for Cubism, we can sum it up by saying that there's a whole lot of irony to the fact that the father of modernism, and at least of Cubism, was an artistic thief. Both Cubism and Primitivism died out right around the middle of the 20th century, but they have long-lasting legacies, especially when it comes to how they influenced the future of art history, what came after them. Primitivism, in some ways, opened the door to a whole new world, some puns intended, of European artistic exploration. Still, the longest lasting and most harmful one of primitivism is its long enduring assumptions about the inferior quality of art from colonized areas of the globe. Primitivism, unfortunately, collectively devalued artworks from African, Aboriginal, and Native American artists. Primitivism's narratives about the inferiority of such artworks have made it difficult to incorporate such artists into art historical narratives. Of course, we as good scholars can't just let that be forever, so how we are fixing it now. A whole lot of continuous work since the late 20th century into the 21st to historically contextualize primitivism, the attitudes behind it, and to really expose its shortcomings, its biases, show how it's ineffective at understanding art from non-European cultures. These efforts are being undertaken by artists and scholars alike. However, primitivism has been used as a response tool in artworks of today as well. Some, especially African artists, use some of the recognizable primitivist traits, characteristics, to reclaim them, to reimagine the fullness of African heritage, as Art Story says, in contemporary society. So while primitivism was a white man's world in the early 20th century and in a lot of ways a pretty skewed attitude, its inherent biases and tropes give artists the tools to use it against itself in really fascinating ways. Possibly the most fascinating thing about primitivism is that it can never really die. It had such an enormous impact on the trajectory of 20th century art that it's always going to at least come up in lectures, in discussions of modernism. Even if it's no longer specifically being practiced, A lot of its characteristics are still found in contemporary art, that collapsing of space, the unusual shapes of figures, the emotional rawness. In that sense, primitivism may be one of the more fascinating movements we will ever see in art history. All right, honeys, that is our episode for the evening. I hope you've enjoyed our first deep dive into some of the fraught parts of art history, some of the bad and the ugly, along with the good. I am happy to finally drop this episode and start catching up on our September backlog. Thank you for sticking it out with me. I always appreciate your patience and your listenership. As always, stay hydrated, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon, honeys. Take care of yourselves. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.